What happens when a media-savvy royal meets an unflinching journalist who refuses to play by palace rules? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with Tamron Hall, expecting softball questions, but instead facing a relentless interrogation that exposes uncomfortable truths. Last night's explosive confrontation left audiences stunned as years of carefully crafted public relations came crashing down in real time. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses clash in the most dramatic television moment of the year. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle stepped onto the Tamron Hall show set last night. Dressed in an elegant cream blazer that seemed to shimmer under the studio lights, she carried herself with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. Her signature smile was perfectly in place as she settled into the guest chair, but seasoned television viewers could detect something different in her demeanor. A slight rigidity that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the evening's arrangement. Tamron Hall, known for her sharp interviewing style and refusal to let celebrities coast through promotional appearances, had clearly done her homework. The veteran journalist sat across from her guest with a stack of notes that seemed unusually thick, for what was supposed to be a discussion about Meghan's latest humanitarian initiatives. The atmosphere in Studio 1A felt charged with an energy that even the production crew seemed to sense. Cameras were positioned at angles that would capture every micro-expression. "Meghan, thank you for being here tonight," Tamron began, her voice carrying that familiar blend of warmth and steel that had made her a formidable presence in television journalism. "I know you're here to talk about your new partnership with several charitable organizations, but I think our viewers would appreciate some context about your recent public statements." Meghan's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "Of course, Tamron. I'm always happy to discuss the important work we're doing to make a difference in communities that need support most." But Tamron wasn't interested in letting her guest settle into comfortable talking points. "I'm specifically referring to your comments last month about media accountability and the responsibility of journalists to tell complete stories. Some interpreted those remarks as criticism of coverage you've received over the past few years. Can you clarify what you meant by that?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Meghan's media training kicked in immediately, her posture straightening, as she launched into what sounded like a carefully rehearsed response about the importance of authentic storytelling in journalism. But Tamron's expression suggested she wasn't buying the deflection. "That's interesting," Tamron interrupted smoothly, "because when I review the coverage you're referencing, much of it was based on documented public records, court filings, and statements from your own representatives. Are you suggesting that reporting factual information constitutes unfair treatment?" Meghan's hands, which had been resting gracefully in her lap, began to fidget with her wedding ring, a telltale sign that the conversation was veering into territory she hadn't anticipated. "I think what's important to understand, Tamron, is that context matters. When stories are told without full context, they can create narratives that don't reflect the complete truth of a situation. Let's talk about context." "Then," Tamron pressed, consulting her notes with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence, "your legal team filed numerous lawsuits against media outlets over the past 3 years, claiming privacy violations and defamation. But many of those cases were either withdrawn or settled out of court with no admission of wrongdoing from the publications. If the reporting was truly inaccurate, why not pursue these cases to their conclusion and clear your name definitively?" The studio seemed to hold its collective breath. This wasn't the gentle celebrity interview format that Meghan had clearly expected. Camera operators adjusted their positions slightly, sensing that they were witnessing something significant unfold. The audience, initially excited to see the former royal in person, now sat in rapt attention as they watched what appeared to be a carefully constructed public image begin to show cracks under professional scrutiny. Meghan's response came with noticeable tension in her voice. Legal strategies are complex, and sometimes the emotional toll of prolonged litigation isn't worth the vindication, especially when you're trying to focus on positive work that actually helps people. But surely vindication would help that positive work, Tamron countered, without missing a beat. If media outlets were truly publishing false information about your character and your actions, wouldn't proving that in court strengthen your credibility for the humanitarian work you want to prioritize? The former actress shifted in her chair, her media-trained composure showing more strain with each exchange. I think you're oversimplifying a very complicated situation, Tamron. When you're dealing with a media landscape that profits from controversy and conflict, sometimes the most powerful response is to rise above the noise and focus on substance. Tamron leaned forward slightly, her journalist instincts clearly engaged. I appreciate that perspective, but let's examine some specific examples. Last year, your spokesperson claimed that a particular story about your interaction with palace staff was categorically false. But when pressed for specifics about what exactly was false, no clarification was ever provided. How do you expect the public to distinguish between legitimate criticism and unfair attacks when your team's responses are often vague or nonspecific? The question struck like lightning. Meghan's carefully maintained smile disappeared entirely, replaced by an expression that suggested she was beginning to realize this wasn't going to be the friendly, promotional conversation she had anticipated. Her voice took on an edge that hadn't been there moments before. I find it concerning that you're essentially asking me to relitigate every story that's been written about me over the past several years. That's not why I'm here, and frankly, it's not productive for anyone. But Tamron was just getting started. Her reputation as an unflinching interviewer was fully on display as she prepared to delve even deeper into the contradictions and inconsistencies that would soon turn this television appearance into a complete disaster for her increasingly uncomfortable guest. Actually, Meghan, I think it is productive, Tamron continued, her voice maintaining that deceptively calm tone that experienced journalists use when they know they've hit a nerve. Because when public figures make claims about media accountability, the public deserves to understand what that actually means in practice. She flipped through her notes with deliberate precision, each page turn seeming to make Meghan more visibly uncomfortable. Let's talk about your recent interview where you discussed speaking your truth. That's become something of a signature phrase for you. But truth by definition isn't subjective. Either something happened or it didn't. Either someone said something or they didn't. When you use phrases like "my truth," are you acknowledging that your version of events might differ from documented facts? Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but the cameras caught it. I think you're playing word games, Tamron. When people have lived experiences, those experiences are valid regardless of how others choose to interpret or report them. But interpretation and reporting are two different things, Tamron shot back without hesitation. Reporting involves documenting what actually occurred. When multiple independent sources confirm the same information, and when that information contradicts your public statements, how do you reconcile that difference? The studio audience, which had been quietly attentive, was now completely silent. Even the usual sounds of shifting in seats had stopped, as everyone sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented. Meghan's publicist, seated in the front row, looked increasingly agitated, checking her phone repeatedly, as if hoping for an emergency that might interrupt the interview. I think what you're doing right now is exactly the problem, Meghan said, her voice rising slightly. You're taking complex human situations and trying to reduce them to some kind of courtroom cross-examination. That's not journalism. That's ambush tactics. Tamron's eyebrows raised slightly. A look that regular viewers of her show knew meant she was about to deliver a particularly pointed response. Ambush tactics. Meghan, these are questions based on your own public statements and documented public records. If asking for clarification about inconsistencies in your public narrative constitutes an ambush, what does that say about the narrative itself? The tension in the room was now so thick it seemed almost visible. Meghan's hands were no longer just fidgeting with her ring. She was gripping the arms of her chair with enough force that her knuckles had gone white. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of anger that was beginning to color her cheeks. You know what, Tamron? I came here in good faith to talk about important work that's helping real people with real problems. But you seem more interested in tabloid-style gotcha journalism than having a meaningful conversation about issues that actually matter. Then let's talk about issues that matter, Tamron replied smoothly, clearly unfazed by the accusation. Your foundation received significant donations from several high-profile individuals and corporations. Public records show that administrative costs consumed nearly 60% of those donations in the first year. Can you explain to viewers why such a large percentage of charitable contributions went to overhead rather than direct aid? The question landed like a bombshell. Meghan's mouth opened slightly, then closed, as if she were struggling to formulate a response. For someone who had spent years navigating complex media situations, this moment of visible confusion was striking. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing every nuance of her expression as she processed what had just been asked. Those figures are, that's not, you're taking financial reports out of context, she stammered, her usual eloquence abandoning her at the worst possible moment. Starting a foundation requires significant infrastructure investment. You can't just write checks and call it charity work. Of course not, Tamron agreed, her tone reasonable but relentless. But 60% for administrative costs is significantly higher than industry standards. The American Institute of Philanthropy recommends that administrative costs not exceed 25% of total donations. Can you explain what specific infrastructure investments required more than double the recommended percentage? Meghan's breathing had become noticeably shallower, and she kept glancing toward her publicist, as if hoping for some kind of intervention. I'm not going to sit here and defend our financial decisions to someone who clearly came into this conversation with a predetermined agenda to make me look bad. My agenda is simple, Tamron responded with steel in her voice, to ask the questions that responsible journalism requires when interviewing public figures who seek to influence public opinion and solicit public donations. If those questions make you uncomfortable, perhaps the issue isn't with the questions. The words hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Meghan's carefully constructed public persona was visibly cracking under the sustained pressure of actual accountability. Her media training, which had served her well in countless previous interviews, seemed inadequate for handling a journalist who refused to accept non-answers and deflections. This is exactly what I mean about the toxic nature of media coverage, Meghan said, her voice now carrying unmistakable anger. You're not interested in understanding our context. You're interested in creating drama and conflict for entertainment value. Tamron leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression remaining professional despite the personal attack. Meghan, asking public figures to explain their public statements and account for their use of public donations isn't toxic. It's fundamental journalism. The fact that you're characterizing basic accountability as an attack suggests a level of defensiveness that viewers might find concerning. The production team was in overdrive, cameras capturing every angle of what was rapidly becoming television gold. The planned commercial break was still minutes away, but the tension in the studio had reached a fever pitch that seemed unsustainable. Something was going to break, and everyone in the room could feel it building toward an explosion that would define this interview and potentially damage one of the participants irreparably. Meghan stood up abruptly from her chair, her movement so sudden that it startled the camera operators. You know what? I don't have to sit here and be subjected to this kind of hostile interrogation disguised as journalism. But Tamron remained seated, her composure unbreakable even as her guest towered over her in what appeared to be an attempt at intimidation. Please sit down, Meghan. We're live on television, and walking away from legitimate questions doesn't make them disappear. It just makes viewers wonder what you're trying to hide. Hide? Meghan's voice cracked with indignation, her carefully modulated tone completely abandoned. I'm not hiding anything. I'm refusing to participate in a character assassination masquerading as an interview. This isn't journalism, Tamron. This is a hit job, and I won't be a part of it. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, some with their phones out, recording what they clearly recognized as a historic television moment. Meghan's publicist had risen from her seat and was making urgent hand gestures toward the control room, clearly hoping someone would cut to commercial and end this nightmare. Tamron's voice remained steady, professional, and devastatingly calm. A hit job would involve making false accusations or asking inappropriate questions. I've asked you to explain your own public statements, clarify documented inconsistencies, and account for the use of charitable donations. If you consider basic accountability to be character assassination, what does that tell viewers about your relationship with transparency? Stop it! Meghan snapped her fingers, pointing directly at Tamron in a gesture that looked almost threatening under the studio lights. Just stop with your sanctimonious lecture about journalism and accountability. You ambushed me with financial records that you took out of context, twisted my words, and created a hostile environment designed to make me look bad, regardless of how I responded. Tamron finally stood, matching Meghan's height but maintaining her professional demeanor, even as her guest appeared to be having a complete meltdown on live television. Meghan, the financial records I referenced are publicly available through your foundation's required filings. The quotes I mentioned are from your own interviews and social media posts. I haven't taken anything out of context. I've simply asked you to explain them. Explain them to who? Meghan's voice was now loud enough that the studio microphones were picking up slight distortion. To you? To an audience that's already made up their minds based on years of negative coverage? To a media establishment that profits from tearing down successful women, especially women of color, who dared to challenge the status quo? The race card had been played, and Tamron's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. As a successful black woman in journalism who had fought her own battles against discrimination and bias, she clearly wasn't going to let that particular deflection pass unchallenged. Don't, Tamron said, her voice carrying a warning that even Meghan seemed to recognize. Don't you dare try to hide behind identity politics when you're being held accountable for your actions. I've faced real discrimination in this industry, real barriers, real challenges based on who I am, but I've never used those experiences as a shield to avoid answering legitimate questions about my professional conduct. Meghan's face flushed deeper, anger and embarrassment warring for dominance in her expression. How dare you lecture me about discrimination? You have no idea what I've been through, what my family has endured because of relentless media persecution. Then explain it, Tamron shot back, her patience finally showing signs of strain. Give specific examples, name the false stories, provide evidence of persecution rather than just making vague accusations. That's what accountability looks like, Meghan. That's what transparency means. The challenge hung in the air, like a gauntlet thrown down, and everyone in the studio knew that this was the moment of truth. Either Meghan would provide the specific evidence she claimed to have, or she would reveal that her accusations were as empty as they appeared to be. For a long moment, Meghan stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to formulate a response that never came. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the barely audible hum of studio equipment and the collective held breath of everyone present. "This is insane," Meghan finally said, her voice now carrying a defeated quality that contrasted sharply with her earlier defiance. "I came here to talk about helping people, about making a positive difference in the world, and you've turned it into some kind of prosecutorial interrogation. You came here as a public figure asking for public support and public donations," Tamron corrected firmly. "The public has a right to know that their support is justified and their donations are being used appropriately. That's not persecution, Meghan. That's citizenship." Meghan began backing toward the edge of the set, her movement awkward and uncertain. "I'm done. I'm absolutely done with this. You can air whatever you want. Edit this however serves your narrative, but I won't be a participant in my own public execution." "There's no editing in live television," Tamron pointed out calmly. "What viewers are seeing is exactly what's happening. Your responses, your defensiveness, your inability to provide straight answers to straight questions, that's not editing. That's reality." The words seemed to hit Meghan like physical blows. She turned toward her publicist, who was now standing and clearly preparing to escort her client off the set. "We're leaving right now. This interview is over." But Tamron wasn't finished. "Meghan, you can walk away from this conversation, but you can't walk away from the questions themselves. They'll still be there tomorrow and the day after that, and viewers will remember how you chose to handle them tonight." Meghan spun around one final time, her composure completely shattered, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You know what viewers will remember, Tamron? They'll remember that you ambushed a guest who came here in good faith, that you prioritized sensationalism over substance, and that you proved exactly why people have lost trust in mainstream media." "What they'll remember," Tamron replied with devastating finality, "is that when asked to account for your public statements and explain your use of charitable donations, you chose to storm off rather than provide answers. That will speak louder than any accusations you want to make about my journalism." With that, Meghan Markle turned and walked off the set, her heels clicking sharply against the studio floor as her publicist hurried after her. The cameras followed her exit, capturing every step of her retreat until she disappeared behind the studio curtains, leaving Tamron standing alone in front of a stunned studio audience. Tamron turned to face the camera directly, her professional composure intact despite having just presided over one of the most dramatic guest walkouts in recent television history. When we return, we'll be discussing media accountability and the importance of asking tough questions, even when the answers are uncomfortable. Don't go anywhere. As the show cut to commercial, the studio buzzed with excited conversation about what everyone had just witnessed. Tamron Hall had done what many journalists had attempted, but few had accomplished successfully. She had cut through years of carefully crafted public relations and forced a confrontation with reality that her guest simply couldn't handle. The aftermath would dominate social media for days. But in this moment, the truth had been served, regardless of how uncomfortable it made everyone involved. Who do you think was right in this argument? Comment below.